In 2023, global startup investment reached $285 billion. Imagine, that vast sum represents hundreds of new ideas and new inventions being created every day all over the world. For deep tech startups which aim to address global challenges like water scarcity, extreme temperatures, and pandemics, the need to safeguard innovations is crucial. One way to do that is through a sound IP strategy. In this two-part series, we get IP experts to answer burning questions from deep tech founders in Singapore. In part 1, we examine the basics that companies need to be aware of. In this second part, we'll look at protection strategies when working with partners.
For example, Coca-Cola, right? The manufacturers in different countries can definitely apply that to your own tech products.
And how to keep the company's IP to a need-to-know basis.
With new hires, if they tend to be salespeople, approach with caution. A typical sales turnover is 1.5 years to 2 years max, and they might end up joining your competitors.
Hey, hi, my name is Jikang. My day job, I just do a lot of slides and a lot of papers. But jokes aside, it's advising companies on IP strategy, on seeing IP as business assets in addition to being legal assets.
Hi, I'm Suchitra Narayan, and I also do investments in the advanced manufacturing space. We actually look at translating IP from either institutes of higher learning or centers of excellence.
Hi, my name is Levy.
Hi, my name is Keith.
Hi, I'm Teck Guan.
Consider a scenario where a startup works with a big company for a distribution deal. The big company can potentially choose not to sell any of the startup's products at all and wait for the startup to die out. And then the big company can just copy the IP from the startup after the startup dies and there is no one to protect the IP anymore.
How much IP should we put on the table when we're negotiating with stakeholders like collaborators or users?
So how does a startup protect itself against a scenario like this?
It's more of a matter of getting to know your partner even before entering the distribution or the commercialization deal. Whether it's a technology licensing play, whether it's a distribution play, that's where the IP comes in to protect your product. For example, they are not performing up to certain standards or milestones. That's where you can choose to end the agreement.
If you look at somebody like an advanced manufacturing startup, right? You might have one manufacturer who does your PCB boards, one who's doing your electric circuits. Maybe you keep your software in-house and the IP is the system. So it's kind of protected even when you're manufacturing.
For example, Coca-Cola, right? They keep the manufacturing recipe secret, right? They have different black boxes, right? They combine the different ingredients so that the manufacturers in different countries never ever get to know what the actual recipe for Coca-Cola is. That's like a F&B example.
But in biotech, it may be a little bit different because you do have to give your license out to the manufacturing partner. Do your due diligence on the organization, right? Make sure that got a reputation to manage and maintain, because the ones with a reputation, the ones that are large, they're unlikely to want to replicate your IP, but more likely to want revenue and recurring revenue from you.
With new hires, general guiding principle for all trade secrets confidential information is that you share on a need-to-know basis. Unless you're hiring a very key person.
100% resonate with that. I think the perspective is particularly with new hires, if they tend to be salespeople, approach with caution. A typical sales turnover is 1.5 years to 2 years max, and they might end up joining your competitors. So with the technology hires or the scientists that you might hire, I think the story is a little bit different and varies case by case. I think you have to look at the IP almost as your platform, and your technologists and scientists are building on top of that platform. They're not reproving your IP anymore. So the details of how you worked on the IP are not required, but what it is and how it can be utilized is probably great to share with the team.
How can startups strategize IP sharing with organizations that they co-develop the IP with?
When we say IP sharing with organizations, we break it down into 3 distinct categories. One is startups typically work with institutes of higher learning, so the academics, right? A joint research collaboration agreement. So while you're working with them, you can agree right up front to say, is it going to be a single IP that you own or that I own, or is it going to be a joint IP, or does the university own it? The second situation is where an organization pays you money to solve a problem. When you take that non-recurring revenue, you go solve a problem, you might stumble across something that is IP worthy. That IP belongs to the organization that paid you money. It's very categoric. But the third scenario is when an organization puts maybe money on the table, you bring your tech on the table, and you say, let's collaboratively work on developing a solution. And in that case, again, to your point, right, you need to negotiate upfront as to who owns the IP. Does ownership matter?
Actually, that's a very good point. The balance between ownership and rights, one was an important one, and that's balanced by the cost as well.
Right.
So with universities, because you're not fully paying for the research, right? I've seen some agreements where they say, okay, even though you're a joint IP owner, you have no rights to IP until you get a license. Right? In those cases, that ownership isn't that useful, right? Because as the IP owner, you have no rights. But if, for example, your collaborator, maybe as a default position, owns all the IP, but you're given a right of first refusal, an option to exclusively license the IP after that, and maybe the terms of that license are maybe sort of spelled out right at the start, and it's quite clear, maybe that's enough, right?
And in Singapore, a lot of IP has a very standard clause, which is JDJO, SDSO. The tricky part comes into the negotiations of the license. And I think sometimes it feels like you're negotiating with a very shrewd investor. They wanted ROIs, they wanted to make sure that we have projections and revenues that we hit. But at the same time, some of the research is actually supported by a public interest in mind. So balancing how much ROI should the public institution collaborator be getting versus how much the company should be getting sounds like a tricky road to manage, and wanted to ask if there's any kind of best practices in negotiating that.
Right, you don't want to drag out the negotiations from the research collaborations or the licenses, because we actually heard of investors walking away when the negotiations take too long, and maybe Suchi can verify that as an investor. But I think it's also important to recognize that the interests are still aligned. Right? It's not a zero-sum game. Both the university as well as the startup want to see the technology being successfully commercialized. But even though it's JDGO or SDSO, whichever it is, the universities usually are quite open to negotiating for an exclusive license, right, to give you the advantage in the market. And usually investors like to see that. Of course, I know investors like to see ownership as well, but absent of throwing a lot of money into the research collaboration, I think exclusive license, given the balance of factors, probably works.
So can I ask you, just out of interest, right? It's either jointly owned or single owned. Is there any advice you have for startups which maybe approach it differently? Like, don't go with the traditional terms. What terms should they think about?
Could be ownership by the field of technology, for example. We've seen that happen with some commercial agreements, right? So so there was this company, they were working with a software company to incorporate the software into their robots, right? So it was a joint collaboration, and the collaboration was set out such that whatever they co-developed, if it builds on the software base that the collaborator might need, right, then the collaborator will own that. But if it works towards more something specific to their robot, then it'll be owned by the startup they're working with.
Right.
And that meets both parties' interests. And you avoid the entire right JDJ or SDSO, but you find the ownership position and the rights position that really is neatly aligned with both parties' business interests.
How can startups protect themselves or be wary of potential people that could breach NDAs or non-competes, but falls in jurisdictions that would not potentially prosecute those people? So examples could be people that deliberately breach some of these clauses or copies your ideas, but then just disappears into a country that will never be prosecuting that person.
We've seen this happen with a couple of startups. And honestly, it's really hard. The legal costs are very, very high to chase them down. And when they're in foreign countries, sometimes you need a local lawyer there, and that's even harder. And then we end up winding the startup down and literally distributing assets in those cases when the founder disappears. Even with co-founders, have those agreements in place, make sure you get some senior people on the board or the investors to look through even founder agreements to say what happens in the event that one founder not goes rogue necessarily, but chooses to stop participating in the startup or doesn't want to be a part of the growth journey, or very early employees who might be a part of the co-ownership of IP, that they don't want to be a part of the next journey. Then what happens to that IP? Who owns it? How do you assign it back to the startup? And I think the one safer way maybe is anything developed is constantly assigned back to the company name and not to the individuals associated with it.
And I also want to make a point that maybe that's not so well understood or often understood, is that employees are allowed to leave with know-how. They're not allowed to leave with trade secrets or confidential information. From that perspective, then you have to look again at the defensibility of different parts of the business or technology, right? Even if someone takes away that know-how, do you still have defensible advantages left, right? And that works towards your entire business and IP strategy too. If you've documented certain processes, you've made it clear that these are trade secrets, then that gives you more options to stop a rogue co-founder or rogue employee from using those trade secrets elsewhere. I think most countries would have legislation against misuse of trade secrets or misuse of confidential information. How strong the enforcement systems are is another question, is another discussion entirely. But at least having those options in the first place puts you in a stronger position.
Everything we've said, we've discussed, sort of puts a paranoia in the mind of the startup founder. We don't want you to be paranoid. We just want you to be aware and do the right things. There are people who can help you do that. Investors, IPOs, lawyers. These are all people who are there to help you protect it. But don't forget the vision of the bigger strategy, the startup strategy.
Defensibility in the tech doesn't always come from patents per se. It can come from trade secrets. It can come from other forms of protection as well, like OpenAI.
I was going to say OpenAI, right?
One of the biggest companies in the world now, right? Most valuable companies in the world. At least based on public information, it seems like they have less than 20 patent families. Right? And that works for them because for the technology, maybe patents aren't the best way to go. So it's about articulating what the advantages of technology are and how you're defending them. That answer may not always be a patent, but you must be able to defend your technology advantages at least.